Everyone. My name is Chris Van Dyck from Cogent Law, and we are delighted to have Steven Kemmerling join us from CRB Monitor. Stephen, in some ways, this call is long overdue. You and I have been at a number of cannabis banking conferences, and for those who are on the line, you know as well as I do that whether Steve is in the audience or whether he's a panelist or speaking, people tend to take note. He is a wealth of information and a trusted source of information. So it's good to finally have you. While the call might be a little bit overdue, it's also extremely timely, given what's happening with hemp. And Steve and I are going to be focusing much of our discussion on that. But I am going to let Steve introduce himself and CRB Monitor, and then after that, I'll jump in and say a few words about myself and Cogent Law. So, Steve, if you want to take it away.
Great. Thank you, Chris and Cogent Law for putting this together. Looking forward to it. And likewise to your kind words. I know you speak at all the same conferences and somehow managed. I don't think we've been on a panel together yet. So that's some of them are active. So I'm glad we're doing this now. But yeah, I'm Steve Kemmerling, the founder and CEO of CRB Monitor. I founded CRB Monitor in, hard to believe, in December of 2014 with the explicit goal of helping regulated financial institutions meet or exceed FinCEN's marijuana banking guidance that is now, as we'll might touch on, 10, 11 years old. And the way that CRB Monitor does that is by aggregating and maintaining what we not so humbly believe to be the best in class referential regulatory database on marijuana business operators, owners, licensing, and enforcement actions. So basically, CRB Monitors is a database of every, and I'm going to use the marijuana word just to be slightly differentiate, aka cannabis, to differentiate from hemp right now. It's a database of every marijuana business in the United States and Canada. And with a lot of minutia and detail about licensing details, as much beneficial ownership data as we can get our hands on. That's always a tricky bit. And cannabis specific enforcement actions. And our clients are, 99% regulatory depository institutions, broker dealers, et cetera, who use our entity and licensing and firmographic data to basically trust but verify, that the MRBs or CRBs that they're working with are duly licensed. Keep an eye on those entities to know if there's been a change in license status, change in beneficial ownership, et cetera, et cetera. Just to be clear, we don't really do cash analytics like some of our friends do in the space. We're really focused on the firmographic data that is kind of needed by everybody. The analytics firms all have reasonable arguments to say their analytics are best. But what is true across the board is you just need to know who your counterparty is. Who's the legal entity? What do they do? That kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yes, Steve, thanks so much for that. I'll say a few words about me and Cogent now. I'm a former financial regulatory attorney, having worked for the Maine Bureau of Financial Institutions for 6 years. And during my last year as a regulator, 2014, like Steve, I jumped ship and started working as general counsel for a financial institution. That was in September of 2014. And just prior to that, in February of 2014, that FinCEN guidance that Steve referenced was issued. And we as a regulator, we were getting a lot of questions from our regulated entities on exactly what this meant for them and how they should proceed. And then when I did join a financial institution up here in Maine in September 2014, we were I was actually asked during my interview, still wearing my regulator's cap, or I asked our CEO whether or not they had a cannabis program, and a very worried look came across his face because I was still wearing my regulator's cap, and he said, "Well, I think we might have a few." And I said to him then that I fully support that and would be willing to kind of take that on. Anyway, on the drive home, I got the offer for the job. I think our CEO was worried that I might report back to our superintendent on this. So anyway, my affiliations changed pretty quickly, and our program developed exponentially, and that was no credit to us. We just happened to be the only game in town up here in Maine. No other financial institutions were willing to take on the risk and the time associated with cannabis banking. So anyway, that was a good thing professionally for me. It certainly got my feet in the door of the CEO's office because not only were we a loss leader, we were now generating pretty significant revenue. We never got on the lending side, but our depository fees represented a pretty significant return on investment there. About 2 years ago, so many of you on this call probably know Josh Radbod. He hosts and organizes through his team the PBC conference. Josh kind of got wind of who I was. They were looking for an attorney who had some expertise on the cannabis banking side. And so, anyway, I've been with Cogent now for just close to 2 years. And what I do four things. I assist and advise financial institutions, both banks and credit unions, who are looking to get into the space at all. I assist those financial institutions that are already in the space on the depository side, but are looking for guidance if they're looking to expand into the lending side, lending piece. I've helped a couple of financial institutions who got into a little bit of trouble with their financial regulators, offering them some remediation on their programs. And I've also worked with a couple of financial institutions who have very well developed, mature CRB banking programs, but their programs have gotten a little bit bogged down uh, and have become inefficient. And they were looking for some advice on how to create efficiencies and become more cost effective, while at the same time staying on the right side of their examiners. Recently, I also am a source. If folks are looking for on-the-spot guidance on a particular issue regarding a CRB, how to handle a CRB, I do pride myself on getting back pretty quickly to clients. So that's kind of what I do. A few words about Cogent. We I made a promise to my wife when I joined, before I joined Cogent, that I would never break back into private practice. I was at a very large a corporate commercial firm in Toronto, Canada, for several years, uh, and there are certain pressures on associates in that work environment that I did not want to get back into. Cogent is a very different law firm. We don't have billing quotas or expectations here. We are extremely client focused and also offer our services at reasonable rates, which isn't always the case. And so anyway, I've been a bit long-winded about me and Cogent. I do want to get on to our discussion now. And Steve, I think we're in very uncharted waters right now with hemp. It's probably a good thing with you. I found out yesterday that Steve is was a NCAA competitive swimmer, a college athlete, and I also made the mistake of comparing times with him. Anyway, I was extremely humbled by that. But we have two swimmers here, former swimmers, I should say, competitive swimmers, having a discussion about these uncharted waters. So I don't know if that's ironic or coincidental, but Steve, why don't you talk a little bit about the hemp ban in the that was passed, the November spending bill, and your initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, and feel free to correct or fill in on some of the specifics, the legalese, if you will. You play the attorney, which you are. And I assume, I see we have a number of people on the call, but I assume everyone probably has a general, if not very good understanding of cannabis, hemp, marijuana, et cetera, et cetera. But in summary, to be clear, hemp in and of itself was not banned. It was certain hemp-derived cannabinoids, and I'll let Chris fill in the details for those if to put you on the spot. But basically, intoxicating hemp is a layperson's summary. But the general, from what I understand, the general growing of hemp has not been banned, i.e., the USDA still has, hemp, general hemp oversight of hemp cultivation. I don't know, maybe you can pitch in a second here, Chris. I don't know if I've heard anything about, certain hemp strains that are known to be THC heavy, but that's getting into some minutia right there. But basically, really, the outcome is, I live in Tennessee. I went to school in Texas. Talk about two hemp-friendly states, and more specifically, intoxicating hemp cannabinoids, right? So these are cannabinoids that are, derived naturally or more typically synthetically from hemp products as the base, so that the hemp being grown is duly licensed, totally fine, based under those rules and regs. But then, entrepreneurs do what they do. They figured out how to make intoxicating products out of things that nobody in 2018 thought could be intoxicating. I don't know if that was true or not in 2018. So you have states like Tennessee and Texas, and not just us, even marijuana-friendly states that have been for several years now trying to where the rise of intoxicating hemp products grew very, very quickly. I think it's as I've seen statistics, it's as large or maybe bigger than the marijuana industry. I'm using the M word just to differentiate very, very clearly. Um, and it's been a challenge, regulation, enforcement, testing, packaging, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So long story short, at a federal level, starting from, I guess, the signature of the appropriations bill, the language was tucked into the appropriations bill that de facto outlawed intoxicating hemp cannabinoids with a 365-day what's the wind down period? I don't know what you call it, Chris. So this interesting, you can't even call it emerging, this interesting intoxicating hemp derived market that's blossomed, which is a near perfect substitute, in my opinion, to regulated marijuana, is going to be outlawed. So before I prognosticate, is that an accurate description, Chris?
Absolutely. And you know as much about the science of this as I do. So the way I think of it, and you correct me, Stephen, if I'm wrong, I think of it as the hemp that's legal is sometimes referred to as industrial hemp. You remember on the Senate that the floor during the Farm Bill, there was talk about rope, not dope. And the 2018 Farm Bill that you referenced, Steve, and that Mitch McConnell, was pushing through, inadvertently only referenced Delta 9 THC, and it did not reference THC cannabinoids. And as with everything, when there's a when there's a gap, an unintentional gap, it's like water seeping. It'll find that hole. It'll find that gap, and that's what happened following the passage of the 2018 Farm Bill. There was this unintended gap or loophole, which provided for hemp-related industries to create THC infused hemp products that didn't carry the Delta 9 strain. Now, Steve, am I talking correctly?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So, what happened was, yeah, this industry was inadvertently created and flourished. It's now a multi-billion nationwide industry, and it's, in my view, created a real conundrum, not only for the industry, but also for the banks that are banking this industry. Because up until now, up until November, from a banking perspective, banking hemp product as opposed to marijuana, using your terminology, Steve, was considered uh, higher risk, but certainly not as high risk with the same compliance burdens as the direct. I call them CRB accounts or MRB accounts, where you had the rolling SAR filings, the enhanced onboarding, the continuous due diligence, and so forth. So anyway, banks and credit unions that have hemp programs as opposed to marijuana programs are, if again, if I were, in a bank or credit union now that had a hemp program, and I was the risk manager or the BSA officer, frankly, I would be putting together a working group right now. First of all, to monitor this situation very, very carefully because it is very much in a state of flux right now. And Steve, maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the attempts that are now being made. And I can fill in as well, but maybe I'll let you get the ball rolling. Some of the attempts that are now being made to kind of roll back this 11th hour provision that Mitch McConnell put in, which, as you say, basically bans 95% of uh, 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 hemps.
Yeah, that's just one or two points before I jump into that. The but it's worth noting that even when hemp was originally legalized or removed from the definition of marijuana in 2018, which is technically what happened, and the definition of marijuana is Delta 9 THC, and that's why this Delta 9 thing. And I don't know why I'm not a chemist, but the market for hemp has almost always been derivative products, not hemp rope. It was CBD. When 2018 happened, what happened? You had the CBD craze, right? So you had the CBD rush, and that accounted. I saw third party reports that said something like 80, 85% of hemp that's grown is being grown for CBD. And that was in 2019, 2020, right? Well, naturally, the CBD craze kind of petered out naturally. Consumers change behavior, so it doesn't cure cancer. I mean, that's not kind of outlandish term, but you know what I mean. But what the chemists figured out is like, well, if I do some chemical stuff, CBD, now we get Delta 8 or Delta 10 or THCA. So that's it's a natural evolution of the market. So that was kind of point one. So growing of hemp has always been all about derivative products, right? Like oil is, yeah, okay, oil's legal, but you make gasoline and petrol and jet fuel and blah 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 blah. It's about what you make from it. So without an end market or derivative product at an end market, there's no market for growing hemp. So the hemp farmers that are friends in Kentucky and Tennessee, uh, that's what's driving the end market. So if the end market goes away, again, it's not hemp that's banned; it's these products that are banned. But obviously, economics says, well, if I can't make products out of it, there's no need for hemp. So that's what's going on. And part two is that's just kind of economics. Is part two on the banking side, and I see some of our friends who are attending. And Chris, you've probably seen this too. And just before this ban, what were banks doing? I had plenty of marijuana friendly clients who would not bank hemp derived products because of this concern of this stuff's unregulated or it's regulated here but not regulated there, and concerns about it being banned, right? So because there was, in marijuana, you have compliance, you have testing, you got regulation, you got agency oversight, you have a robust but federally illegal, regulated industry. Whereas in hemp, you had what was, loophole. And there have been and are some states that regulate hemp-derived cannabinoid similarly, or if not exactly the same as they do marijuana products. So my point being that I've seen all flavors of banking in the hemp cannabinoid space. And I'm going to differentiate that from hemp, just the hemp growing. So meaning we have marijuana friendly banks who were like, no way. I have banks who are like, I'm only going to do hemp cannabinoids because it's not federally legal. And they have some that'll do both. But most banks won't do either, right? So that's kind of the two by two matrix. So that being said, sorry, I forgot the question, Chris. Do you want me to forward look now? And I know we got.
No, that's quite all right. And I think that's a
Oh
very,
yes.
very useful. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
So I remember the question was, okay, so the ban went in place. What's happening now? So obviously the industry, understandably, is up in arms. I don't know how they're surprised by this. Frankly, it's been in people have been talking about it for 2 years at least. I guess maybe some folks feel blindsided. From what I've heard from certain people in DC or lobbyists, is like this is not a surprise to certain people at all.
Hmm.
But that being said, just yesterday there was a bill put forward. I was Googling it, a bill put forward by two senators, Biden, Wyden, Democrat from Oregon, and Merkley, Democrat from both from Oregon, to basically regulate hemp cannabinoids, right? To kind of move it from total ban to regulation. And there's been various flavors of that. But the crystal ball reading is Steve Kemmerling's crystal ball reading is, hey, marijuana is illegal. There's no federal regulation of marijuana other than it's illegal, yet 40 plus states and agencies and territories have marijuana programs and licensing and regulation. And this is probably an obvious statement, but my assumption is many, if not most states over time will just move this intoxicating hemp into their marijuana, aka cannabis licensing and regulating regime, because it's marijuana is federally illegal. So I don't want to say who cares, but who cares if hemp is illegal? If hemp, so marijuana has been illegal the whole time. So that's Steve's total prognostication, which I just think means for all of our cannabis friendly bankers on the call, you're going to have to do maybe some more lifting than you were previously doing on hemp. Or maybe you weren't doing the hemp because it wasn't regulated. So maybe it's actually an opportunity because that's like three crystal balls there, Chris. I think something's going to happen. I cannot imagine the cannabinoid hemp industry just going away. That seems crazy. But if something doesn't happen between now and 350 days or however long it's been, theoretically it will be a problem. Like
Yeah, no, I
theoretically,
think
it
I
literally
agree with
will be a
all of
problem.
I agree with all of that. In addition to that bill that you just mentioned, which I think was only introduced yesterday by
Yesterday,
the
yeah, this was
two
yesterday afternoon.
Oregon senators, there was I think a bill introduced earlier by Nancy Mace, a Republican from Congresswoman from South Carolina, I believe, and then I think Rand Paul, who's become a huge outspoken advocate for the hemp industry. He's introduced his own bill, which basically, I think I've got this right, would eliminate the federal preemption problem and allow states to have to oversee hemp regulation on a state by state basis without worrying about preemption. So there, and then in addition, as you mentioned, there's this a 1 year waiting period before uh, things start before the ban goes into effect. That's going to give an opportunity, I think, to regulators, the FDA and the DEA, to weigh in with some rulemaking, which could soften the ban a little bit. Regulations have to be consistent with the statute that statute that implements those regulations. So that's going to be some that's going to involve uh, some tricky writing. So and again, but again, getting back to what this means for financial institutions, again, if I were a chief risk officer or BSA officer at a financial institution, I wouldn't be, I wouldn't be just sitting there hoping that the ban gets repealed. I think you really do need to start thinking about, what you're going to do from a risk management perspective if you do have a hemp portfolio. And, the first thing that would come to my mind is, ensuring that you scrub your accounts so that you know exactly which of your accounts are hemp accounts. And then, you might want to consider, you know, uh, distinguishing between, which accounts are operate on an intrastate level versus interstate level, because I do think the ones that are operating between state lines, I think that those accounts actually represent more risk than the ones that are operating within a state that has a state regulatory regime in place for those hemp accounts. The other thing that I would be considering is communicating early on with your hemp customers or members, letting them know that you're aware of the situation, you're monitoring the situation closely, and developing a Q&A uh, you're going to be getting, if you haven't already, and you have a hemp portfolio, you're going to be getting questions from your hemp customers. The other thing I would be considering, again, I'm not recommending this, but these are things that you should be thinking about, and that is possibly putting a freeze on opening new hemp accounts, at least for the time being. Um, anyway, those are some thoughts that I have. Steve, yesterday when we were prepping for this call, we talked a lot about FinCEN and what or possibly what not FinCEN is going to do. I'll start. I'm going to open it up to you first, and then I'll throw in some thoughts.
I'll do what I typically do. I'm going to add two more sprinkles of thoughts on one or two things you were saying that got my juices flowing, then come to interagency guidance. Um, I'm glad you brought it up, and this is honestly probably the biggest financial risk to the hemp derivatives market, the hemp cannabinoid market, is the concept interstate versus intrastate. So we were having this conversation, and my initial reaction is like, "What's the big deal? Like marijuana's, licensed the state to state." And Chris and others like, "Steve, this is national. These are interstate businesses, right? They have a massive production facility of hemp intoxicating adult beverages, and I'm saying California, wherever it is, and they're shipping those across the country, right? So if they have to replicate that, just like in marijuana in 30 different states, that kills the economics, right, of it. So really good point. And thank you for bringing it up. That is a significant difference between the current hemp industry and post federal. If in fact a ban does go in place, like let's assume worst case ban does go in place, interstate theoretically is killed, but Steve thinks the cannabis friendly states have been talking about facilitating interstate on marijuana. This might actually be a catalyst to facilitate interstate hemp derived and say, hey, and this comes to my next point, hey, feds, come and enforce it. And I'm not trying to sound like super libertarian or whatever, but it's the DEA and FDA. This is not going to be on the radar in terms of enforcement priority. I have talked directly to people in both of those agencies, and just like FDA and DEA are not enforcing marijuana law right now, they're dealing with some other stuff if nobody noticed. So that they're currently, unless again with this administration things can change on a dime, I don't see much, if any, strong, robust federal enforcement, even if the law does go into play. Again, that doesn't help any of the banks, though. Chris, like none of your banks are like, nobody's enforcing it. Who cares? I know none of the banks on this call would follow that, but I do think that's a mitigating factor. But to answer Chris's question, we're referring to FinCEN. Will FinCEN update its marijuana banking guidance? This is a bunch of crystal ball. I apologize, folks. I don't think so. When I talk to people at FinCEN off the record, because no one at FinCEN will ever go on the record about anything, they regret even writing the marijuana banking guidance. They're like, it's been such a pain in the beep, they're just like, we get so much slack for it, and they don't want to do an update to it, and they don't want to have ownership. That being said, what we can point to is there is interagency guidance, regulatory guidance on hemp banking. the Federal Reserve and OCC and the FDIC came out with a interagency guidance about hemp banking. And this was after a bunch of questions about can I bank hemp or not bank hemp? I think it was 2020, 2021. I forget the exact time frame.
Yep.
So my crystal ball reading is don't expect anything from FinCEN. And good agency, but they're anti-money laundering focused. And yes, I know they write guidelines, but based on my conversations, they really dislike talking about marijuana. So I don't expect anything from them. I don't expect updated, but I would expect updated interagency guidance, and or maybe they'll have to rescind. I could be completely wrong. I reserve the right to be 100% wrong on that prognostication, though.
You and
So
me both, Steve. And
yeah,
I agree with you on FinCEN. I don't think we're going to, again, crystal ball gazing. I could be proven completely wrong on this, but I know already that FinCEN has been criticized in legal circles as well as from policymakers that they haven't already updated their guidance, which is now 11 and a half years old. Given the fact, when they issued that guidance, only 20 states had legal cannabis programs, and now it's upwards around 40. And even James Cole, the fellow who authored the what's known as the Cole Memorandum, which kind of formed as the provenance for that FinCEN guidance. I remember him speaking at the PBC conference several years ago. He was the keynote speaker, and it was a very different kind of keynote. Usually you don't hear a lot of substance in a keynote speech, but he very publicly lamented the fact that his memo created an unduly restrictive regime for banks and credit unions to bank cannabis. And in spite of that very public lamentation, there's again, we've FinCEN has been very, very quiet. So I would agree with you. I don't think we're going to see any revision from FinCEN. I think the other question is whether FinCEN needs to revise its guidance. Is another question. I think it's another fair question, given the fact that again, if the ban stays in place, hemp becomes a Schedule One product, and therefore, yes, the FinCEN guidance applies. But again, these are things that banks and credit union, their risk departments and their BSA departments ought to be preparing for right now.
that's a really good point, Chris. And I would love if this was just a big open room and we had all the hands, like like we do at PBC, because I'm sure we got 100 opinions. But that's a very salient point. Is hey, this it's not, they're not redefining it as marijuana per se legally, but it's basically the exact same treatment as marijuana. Marijuana defined as cannabis with greater than 0.3% delta 9 THC. This is cannabis with greater than total THC. So I don't, again, I'm not an attorney either, a legal specialist, but they're basically saying that this is Steve's summary. This is basically marijuana.
Yeah.
That's not technically correct. Therefore, existing FinCEN guidance applies, which I think you and I talked about that yesterday. Like that's spot on. So yes. So
Yeah.
I still think you can still bank hemp growers who are licensed by the state or licensed by the USDA. You hear me repeatedly say that to differentiate the segments of hemp. And I know we'll summarize by saying hemp, and I'm going to say what Chris means is he means intoxicating hemp products
Yes.
versus hemp, the product
Yeah.
grown in the ground.
Yeah. We should call it IHP IHP industry. I think
Yeah.
that might be better and
Yeah.
about more accurate. If I were, getting back to FinCEN and how we're going to treat, if the ban stays in place, one thing I would be considering is, as we've discussed, okay, you're going to have to treat these accounts like licensed CRBs, the ones that you were just talking about, Steve, and do the SAR filings on them on a rolling basis, and possibly saying, at the end of your narrative or coding these accounts, not only marijuana limited, marijuana priority, but maybe in brackets putting in IHP so that all these accounts are properly coded or your filings are properly coded so that you know which ones are actually your IHP accounts versus your true CRB accounts with a note in your narrative that you're doing this filing out of an abundance of caution. As a former regulator, you're not going to be heavily criticized for overfiling as opposed to underfiling. That's at least been my experience. You might get a recommendation about that. We again at my FI, we were filing on our indirects for a long time, and then we had an examiner who told us, you really don't need to do that. And so we did carve out our indirects from our directs, but we had another enhanced monitoring program, due diligence program for our indirects. So anyway, those are things that from a risk management point of view, if you're at an FI, you should be considering right now. Um, Steve, what do you think about my suggestion about the filings?
I agree. Unfortunately, it's like again, if you follow the logic tree of FinCEN guidance is as close as you're going to get, and that's not marijuana, but it's basically is again it's not technically. And the attorneys in the room are like, Steve, shut up, Larry. But it's basically in the spirit being treated. Yeah, I don't see how you get around it. Although the note I just typed myself, I just typed two notes as you were speaking. One, going back to interagency guidance, if I'm the OCC or Federal Reserve or FDIC, they might be like, well, let's wait and see what happens with any of these bills that are being submitted. So they
Yeah.
might not do any guidance because they're waiting to see if Rand Paul's thing or Wyden's thing goes through. And or maybe it's a catalyst for the great discussed Safe Banking Act, which would be de facto guide. I mean, actually, the safe banking requires FFIEC and guidance to be updated. That's part of safe banking. So to squeeze some lemonade out of this lemon could be a catalyst for a bunch of things that are actually very helpful to the cannabis industry. Um, I actually think it's a natural evolution. Many others have said this hemp derived stuff is near perfect substitute, for marijuana. Why isn't it regulated, tested? It should all be under the same cannabis umbrella. Anyone who's watching my webinars, I have cannabis and I have marijuana, then I have hemp, then I have hemp derived products, CBD, Delta 8, Delta 10. That's how we think about the world. It's a very logical conclusion over, but what's the timeline? And that's basically what that's what I'm trying to project. What is the timeline for that? So today, how does it help anyone? Talk to Chris, and I think everything you're saying is spot on. Is you need to come up with a plan. What's our exposure? What's our hemp exposure today? Interstate, intrastate, where do they play? Assume the worst, i.e., that the enforcement goes in and that the states don't ramp up quickly enough because there could be a timing lag. Now, certain states like Minnesota have already thought this ahead and they already do both. But that's the exception, not the rule. So I hate saying it. And then Chris, you're the banking regulator and attorney, but it's like the worst case, which is bad for the industry, the cannabis, the hemp industry, forget what our terminology is there might be a time when certain banks have to exit those relationships because the timing, the Gantt charts don't align between guidance or safe banking or a passing of a law. Sorry, I feel like I'm just preaching and not adding much value.
No, no, I think everything you pointed on is spot on. And yeah, there given, depending on timing, banks may be faced with having a certain portfolio that is neither federally legal nor state regulated. And that
Exactly.
that that's a big BSA problem.
Yeah.
Uh,
I,
so
I I'm hopeful that I'm hopeful that won't happen, that one or two or three of these things could happen between now and then. It sounds like a good article for us to write, Chris, because there's kind of three outcomes that could occur. And there's a scenario where any one of them occur, or there's also a scenario where none of them occur. And that's really the worst case. Yeah.
Yeah, and just
But
I also want to just get back to your point about the timing and the interagency guidance. I agree with you that the regulators are going to wait. before there's some certainty on all this. We've got these three bills out there, and they're going to be in no rush to put out any further guidance on this until there's some certainty on the legislative side in terms of what to do. So again, and that does not bode very well for financial institutions that it may turn out after November 2026 that they are banking federally illegal and industries that are not state regulated. That could very well be a problem. So anyway, that also gets back to my point about early communication with hemp members uh, and just informing them. I don't think you need to be the harbinger of terrible news right now. But certainly let them know that there's an issue out there. We're monitoring it closely and have a Q&A ready. And if anyone needs any help with that, I can certainly assist in that regard.
One thought, Chris, I'll put it out there. So, but it's kind of indirectly on our talking bullet points. This is not a lending discussion, comma, but as we start to think about the downstream impact of this, I'm mainly thinking depository accounts, right? Like, oh, you get sorry, it'll be a bummer, you have to shut these down. But the banks that were hemp friendly were lending on equipment, lending on farmland, lending on processing equipment, lending on warehouses that are all used in the hemp derived market. So as part of this exposure analysis, again, I assume this is obvious. You need to find what's my lending exposure to anything, at any point, anywhere on this hemp ecosystem, because that's just going to be a financial risk, right?
Huge,
Even if the state starts
huge.
to regulate, but you have a 100,000 square foot warehouse for a guy who was making hemp infused beverages and distributing it to 50 states. I mean, anyways, that's obvious, but that's a major credit risk that someone's going to have to give unfortunate news to the CFO. Don't necessarily need to write it down, but it's going to have to be bumped up on your risk ratings on your balance sheet.
Yeah. Steve, I am so glad you brought up lending because that is a huge financial risk. And those financial institutions that are offering commercial lending to your hemp folks, I would be reviewing your loan documentation very, very closely now, or having somebody review that loan documentation for you, looking at your covenants to see whether or not there are provisions in there that would allow you to call the loan in the event, and then also having having some heart-to-heart discussions with the CFOs of those companies to let them know what the scoop is on all that. So huge, not only are we talking about a compliance risk here or BSA risk, we're talking about financial risk on the lending side for sure. Steve, we haven't even talked about the Safe Banking Act, Safer Banking Act. I know we should probably say a word or two about it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, generally assume folks are aware of it, but in case not, the safer banking bill, correct me if this isn't quite right, Chris, basically provides safe harbor to a certain list of regulated financial institutions for knowingly and effectively banking cannabis related businesses, i.e., marijuana related businesses, which presumably now includes intoxicating hemp. Everyone on this call has probably been, how long has it been going? 7 years, something like that.
Eight
It's been
years, I
passed
think. Yeah, 7 or 8 years.
times by the House, and then once it came out of the Senate Banking Committee.
Yes.
Um, I like everything in cannabis. I always hear whispers from certain people, this thing's it's going to get passed. But I think the recent word from the Hill is that it just keeps getting backburnered because of so many other things going on in the Trump administration or just Congress in a whole. So it still kind of feels bipartisan, but they're just wobbling on everything else that I don't know that this one gets across the finish line. Unless, again, maybe
No,
this hemp thing is actually a catalyst to it.
possibly, but that's been my read as well, that it's been pushed. It's a slow burn issue, and I have not gotten a lot of eyewash on safer banking. So I don't hold a lot, I don't hold out a lot of hope for that passing in the near future. As you say, the current administration has had a lot of bigger fish to fry and putting in, fires to put out. So I think marijuana in general has been kind of pushed to a back burner with the administration. We heard, on the reschedule. Let's talk about rescheduling for a minute here. We heard, Trump. I think it was on August the 11th. He was asked at a press conference about rescheduling, and he said back then that his administration was considering it and that uh, we'd be hearing something in the next few weeks. But again, radio silence on the rescheduling front as well. I had heard at one point, you notice in the title of our today's conversation that we have the word descheduling in there. I had heard I had heard rumors about descheduling, and that's again those have kind of disappeared for the moment. And I think that rescheduling again has, we've been getting kind of inconsistent messaging from the administration on all this on marijuana. So I think if there was at one point in time, maybe this past summer, some momentum toward rescheduling, again, my lack of eyewash that I is that this again has kind of been pushed to the back burner. Steve, what about you?
Yeah, I'm not too close to DC, and we all have friends, and we all hit a lot of tea leaf reading. I've heard the whole spectrum. It's nowhere close to what is today? Last week, somebody said, I heard it that Trump's going to announce something that's going to be rescheduled by the end of the year, as in the next like 2 weeks. Rescheduling. I still side under overs. No, Steve's personal under over is no. If anything, again, this is I don't even represent CRB Monitor. This is Steve Kemmerling's own opinion, right? Is if anything, if somebody's trying to win votes, they deschedule it right before next year's midterms, right? Because your average voter doesn't give a hoot about safer banking, right? Like it won't really matter. But if somebody deschedules something, and I wouldn't, given the brashness, aggressiveness of the Trump administration, that almost seems more logical in some ways. But how do you center that with the fact that Congress just passed to criminalize hemp? So I don't know. Anyways, this is not helping anyone on the call too much. But rescheduling under over, no. For unlike on the ESPN Talking Heads, Steve says no. Uh, in the
I'm
next
with
six
you on
months.
that one. I'm with you on that one as well. Politically, you're right. It would be a very, very savvy move to deschedule, given, what the Gallup polls show on marijuana. And but and again, I don't have any ins on Washington either. But given what's lacking in my email box these days, I don't see that happening either. Um, we're coming up to close to the end of our hour. Do we have any questions from folks?
I just want to say one thing, and it
Yeah,
was on
please
our
do.
call notes, Chris. So now,
Yeah.
if rescheduling does happen, I don't think much changes in cannabis banking.
Great point. Great point. Yeah, nothing changes until the FinCEN guidance is updated. So that's a very important point to note, and also a very important thing to communicate with your cannabis customers or members, because there's going to be a lot of confusion if rescheduling happens. I think cannabis or marijuana businesses are going to think, oh, we should just be treated like normal accounts right now. So again, that's something else that banks and credit unions should think about. I actually, uh, I don't know if you remember, but 3 or 4 years ago during the lame session, everyone thought cannabis was marijuana was going to be rescheduled. I had actually drafted a letter up, uh, and I can certainly, if folks when that time comes, if they want any assistance in terms of drafting a missive out to your CRB members or customers, I can certainly assist with that because there is going to be confusion on that front.
And ditto, even though, despite what we just said on safer banking, in my opinion, ditto on safer banking.
Yes.
And now, ideally, safer banking, if passed, does have a trigger that mandates a review of FinCEN and FFIEC. And I think everyone hopes that they rationalize the SARS filing, maybe the transaction analysis piece, and refines that to ideally kind of decrease the onus on banks. But that's a bunch of ifs, if statements in a row that would have to line up. And again, reschedule. Is there, Chris and I, we have like a book to write, like if this happens, then this, or this happens, a combination of these things. But ultimately, and I don't want to sound too biased, ultimately, cannabis will still be a high risk industry for a while. The basic stuff I think banks are doing now in terms of EDD, KYC, monitoring, unlikely to change in any scenario of what you're currently doing. Again, this is kind of, maybe I'm doing a de facto summary. If the worst case scenario of the hemp stuff is you might have to exit some accounts if something doesn't happen. From a KYC risk compliance perspective. And then, as we also talked about on the lending perspective, is unfortunately, if you have exposure, you need to sit with your lending team, or they need to sit with it and say, let's stress test this loan portfolio, right? So,
Yeah. So anyway, a lot of ifs during this conversation. Steve, it's been wonderful getting your insights on all this. Really, really appreciate your taking the time to be with us today. And yeah, if we could, I don't have my.
we do have two questions.
Yeah, sure.
Should I just read them? Let's
Yeah,
see.
why don't you
The
do
one
that?
is, do you think rescheduling changes how adult rec states are regulated, i.e., more federal oversight? Seems inevitable that it would. So, how would you predict adult rec markets adapt? Again, this is from a rescheduling perspective.
So, rescheduling, that's a great question and something that we should have brought up. The rescheduling would only, so the rescheduling applies to the plant. It basically takes cannabis off Schedule 1 and puts it on to Schedule 3. It doesn't speak to the use of the product. Uh, so um, I'm not sure. I want to make sure that I answer this question accurately. Is the from a banking perspective, I don't, again, as we discussed, I don't think it changes anything from a banking perspective. Uh, the rescheduling, it's you're still going to have to do your filings until the FinCEN guidance is issued, whether it's adult use or medical use. Um, but I want to, I'm not sure that I've answered the question accurately. Steve, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. And I should note that the second question was very similar because
Yeah.
I think we can answer both in a nutshell and then maybe wrap it up since we're at 12:59. The second question was if cannabis is rescheduled Schedule 3, what parts of existing FinCEN guidance would apply or not? Steve Kemmerling's answer, not as an attorney, but as just a practitioner for 10 years, is I don't think anything changes.
I
And the
agree.
reason is because you take them from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, it is still a federally illegal drug in as much as it's not an FDA reviewed or approved drug. So marijuana is a component, but Schedule 3 drugs, you have to be a pharmaceutical, FDA approved pharmaceutical lab producing pharmaceutical grade medicine. Nothing in any marijuana anywhere right now qualifies for that. So it might actually might actually make medical marijuana possible as a FDA reviewed and approved drugs that go
Down
through
the
three
road,
to five
years down the
years
road. Right.
exactly down the road. I don't think anything changes in either because you basically have bootleg, non-FDA approved Schedule 3 drugs, which again, you have to be
Yeah.
a Schedule 3 drug is, there's a whole bunch of FDA stuff. It's not like it just magically, oh, Steve can start making anabolic steroids in his bathtub if he
Yeah.
wants. That's a Schedule 3 drug. It was my tongue in
Yeah.
cheek. I
Yeah.
actually don't
They're,
think
they're,
anything changes.
yeah. Steve, thanks for pulling that out because that's what I meant to draw is that the it's going to be years before there's a even with rescheduling, it's going to be years before there's a regulatory registration and licensing process involved for that. So, even again, if it gets off Schedule 1, it's still going to be federally illegal, at least, from a regulatory point of view, not from a criminal point of view, but certainly from a regulatory point of view. And from a banking point of view, again, like Steve just said, nothing changes.
It helps though. So despite that, it's
And
still
I think
incremental improvement.
I think it certainly there's some de-risking there
Correct.
from a compliance perspective. I think the examiners, again, I'm not a regulator anymore, but I would have thought that if it goes to Schedule 3, your examiners might take a more elastic view of your CRB program, but who knows? I don't know. Okay, well, listen, it is. Yeah, we're 1 minute after one, and I do want to respect people's time. Steve, again, thank you so much for your insights today. Really great to have you on with us. And there are our contact details. Please feel free to contact me. My cell phone number is not on there, so I do want to give that out. 207 0196. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, concerns, comments. And I'd be more than happy to talk to your boards if you want want a ex-regulator's perspective on this. Please feel free to reach out to me. Again, Steve, thank you so much. Really appreciate your
Hey,
time.
thank you. It's a lot of
And thanks
fun.
everyone for joining.